sixth period. Anybody remembers that tiring sixth period is at the end of the day? I stood up in front of the class and reading something very important that I wanted my government and economics class to listen to. And so we were reading and reading and reading, and all of a sudden the class got very quiet. And I realized I had fallen asleep. And I'm sure all the students were asleep too, so it really didn't matter. I went out and got a drink of water, and they probably just slept through the rest of the day. So if anybody goes to sleep, a lot of times, though, the longer I taught, I used to tell the students, I said, you may not like what I teach, but you heard me, because I've always taught too loud. But anyway, going on with the story about the story. When Calhoun was started in 1852, the people chose the name John C. Calhoun, who was had been vice president under Mr. Jackson. He'd been Secretary of War. He and two other guys helped push the War of 1812. So he'd been an important person in American politics, American history. And so they chose the name. And of course today it'd be very controversial because Mr. Calhoun owned slaves, and it's so complicated about trying to change history. We can't change our history. But anyway, Calhoun was started. It was supposed to be 600 yards from the courthouse. So the courthouse was evidently already built, and it was 600 yards. And a man named John P. King came up from Augusta and bought a lot of land around here, and he gave land to the churches. And he gave the land to the government to build to where to keep the city from being infected by the water. There was a mill pond when you go into what is now the Rome Road, and the people thought at night that the bad water, the bad air from above the water was what caused malaria. There were pine trees between here and the high school, and that was what we call the pine thicket. So he gave that land to the city, and that's the reason where Calhoun High School was built. Originally, Calhoun High School stood on College Street. If you look at the streets in Calhoun, the reason that was called College Street was there was a college at the time. So what people would do in those days, if you had a person who wanted to teach school, you could call it a college. So that was College Street, and there was a little white building in what is now on the location of where the First Baptist Church is, and it was there, as Miss Lily Pitts said, this is where the boys went off to the war from that place. Then later on, the Calhoun City Schools were planted there, and then eventually it moved from that street. The elementary school stayed there, and the high school went to where the high school is now. And that was where Mr. John P. King had given the land for the city to have whatever it wanted to. The other questions of things that are interest is the importance of a man named Richard Peters. Richard Peters was a very important person in Georgia history, and it's interesting how history is, how we forget. We forget who dug the roads, who started the buildings, who made the sacrifices, who cut the trees down, who built the houses and all those things. But anyway, Richard Peters came up from Atlanta. First of all, he came down from Pennsylvania and helped build the city of Atlanta. Originally, if you remember the story of Atlanta, first of all, it was called Marthasville, then it was called Terminus, and then eventually it was changed to Atlanta, and Richard Peters helped change it to the city change the name to the city of Atlanta. He did things like he gave the land for the state capitol down there. He gave the land, his home was where the First Baptist Church was. He helped straighten out the road so they could build a trolley system in Atlanta. But he came up to Calhoun and bought something like 1,500 acres, and he made what he called an agricultural experiment farm. And this was wonderful to come up to get away from Atlanta, because, for example, people would come up to Calhoun. There was an important hotel called Calhoun Hotel, who stood where the doctor's office is right next to the railroad tracks. And people would come up to Calhoun to get away from the city of Atlanta. They would come to Calhoun, which was a nice thing to do. But going back to Richard Peters, his experimental farm involved bringing in all kinds of grass seeds and all kinds of animals to see which animals would be best. He imported Angora goats, the first Angora goats to over here. He spent something like $50,000 with experimenting things. When the Yankees came through in 1864, of course they destroyed a lot of his farms. They did not burn his house, but anyway, they destroyed a lot of his property. And after the war was over, he just went up to the United States government and said, I really didn't support the Confederacy, so he got his money back. But anyway, he would come up here, which is a good way to increase your resources. But he came up, and it's kind of interesting, he had a friend named Henry Grady. Henry Grady was one of the leaders in Atlanta at the time, and if any of you know anything about journalism, you know the Henry Grady School of Journalism, and now Grady Hospital in Atlanta, and all kinds. And there's a Grady statue. Has anybody seen the Grady statue in Atlanta? It's just a wide place. It's right surrounded by huge buildings. It's a seated and it's 5 points. It's where they come together, and he's in the middle. And one of these days, I'm sure that will disappear because people don't appreciate who cut the trees down and all those things. But anyway, Mr. Peters was a friend of Henry Grady's. He was the man who was the editor of the newspaper. In fact, first he came to Rome and bought a newspaper. Then he went down to Atlanta, and he was one of the leaders in the city down there. And he went up to Boston as a speaker, and he said, this was after the Civil War, this was in the 1870s, and he said, we're going to have a New South. We're going to be based the New South not on agriculture, not on cotton, but we're going to have agriculture. It's going to be the New South. I mean, not on agriculture. It's going not to be on agriculture. It's going to be on industry. So we're going to have the New South, and that term grabbed the time, and that was the cotton exposition of the time. So they started pushing agriculture because cotton was so important when cotton was there. But of course, the reason we have to have freezes in the winter, does anybody know why we have to have freezes? What do we have to kill? The boll weevils. Got to kill them boll weevils. Did anybody ever pick cotton out here? Did anybody ever? Hold up your hand, let me see how many people picked cotton. Yeah, boy, you people are lucky that didn't pick cotton. Is always anybody that ever picked cotton always found out one thing, and you probably were told by your kinfolks that was one thing they didn't want to be was a farmer. In 1940, for years we had cotton picking days in the county. The county schools would close in July, and then they would open again in October so the students could get out and pick cotton. Well, in 1940, during the World War II, they let the Calhoun City Schools out. Well, I got to go pick cotton. I went out to L.P. Owens' farm. It was a wonderful day. I took fried pies. My mother made the best fried pies. Went out I picked cotton all day long. We just had a wonderful day. I took them up to be weighed, and I picked 25 pounds of cotton. If anybody knew Chadwick's brothers or his sisters, each one of the Chadwick children could pick I was told, could pick 500 pounds of cotton. That's a bale of cotton, I was told. 500 pounds, that was really a hard day's work, and you certainly learned whether or not you wanted to pick cotton or not, because you usually said no. But anyway, let's see.
You're doing great, Jim.
What I want you to do is, as the little piece of paper before you, if you have anything, I think I may have told you this, if you have a question that you want me to talk about or something we can talk about even later, something you want me to remember, a story that you want me to remember. Because so many times, if any of you know me well, you may have heard all these stories, because some of you, I've noticed, have already gone to sleep. Because after all, it's hard to listen to somebody who has a hard, loud voice. In 1852, Calhoun was a small place. So when the Yankees came through in 1864, as you know, we had the Battle of Resaca. And what happened there was that the Southern troops were being pushed down from Chattanooga, the big engagement at the Battle of Chattanooga, Battle of Lookout Mountain and all those things. And they came down to Resaca because that was a place they were protecting the railroad. And so the railroad, the way the geography lay, we could get involved there, and we could stop the Yankees from coming down. Well, of course, what happened? Well, first of all, the village of Resaca was just a crossroads indeed, and the reason it was called Resaca was when it was originally when the railroad was being put, that we had some Irish workers who were on the railroad there, and they named where they were camped, they called it Dublin. So that was originally Dublin, and then when the people of Gordon County went down to the Mexican War in 1848, there was a battle called Resaca de la Palma. So that's where, as a result of the local citizens being involved in that, they said that we would call our village Resaca. Some of the people that lived out in Sonoraville said that there was a battle called Sonora, and so they says we're going to call our village down there, we'll call it Sonora. But then the people at the post office found out that there was Sonora down below Atlanta, so they had to change it to Sonoraville. So that's where the two communities came. They got their names. But the people after the Battle of Resaca, the troops were going to the Southerners realized that they were going to get captured if the Yankees came down along the area and from Sugar Valley around and could be cut off. So there was a battle at what they call Lay's Ferry, which was one of my great-great-grandfather's ferry there, which is just a crossroads. So it didn't last long because they changed the railroad, the highway down through there. But anyway, as the Yankees went through Calhoun, there was a woman who was a nurse, and she was nursing the Southern boys, and she's written a book that we had a copy of her diary. First of all, she said something I've always thought was really interesting. This woman who was, I don't think she was a Calhoun person, but she was writing what was happening. She said if the people of North Georgia had voted on secession, they would never have voted on being out of the Union. Because you think about this, folks. I've wondered about the Revolution. If your kinfolks had been here in the Revolutionary War, would you have wanted to give up your citizenship and not be an English citizen? We were Britishers. And if they always said, by the way, if King George had any sense and not treated the colonists like he treated his own children, that perhaps we would still be British citizens today. But anyway, and in the war, you just wonder, we've always been an American. Why would we want to withdraw from the United States of America? I used to tell my Peace Corps friend who lived in Michigan, we were so glad to have you in Michigan. I remember when we admitted you all to the Union. And one of the things he said, when the black folks wanted to have reparations, for the money, my Peace Corps friend said, we don't have to give any money. My family came from Norway. I said, well, I'm sorry, I have to pay. But because it's real complicated about the past and how we appreciate or don't appreciate the past. But as we withdrew from the war, yeah. All right. One of the things I'm supposed to talk about is Oakley.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, how are we on time? I don't have my watch. I'm just going to talk for an hour now.
It's 2 a.m.
All right, good enough. I hate to hear people snore from where one thing before I get to Oakley, well, we're going to talk about Oakley, the Historical Society. Does anybody else have anything you want to bring up? Y'all are more... Yeah, all right. All right. Yeah. 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 All right, good. Good.
Tell the real story of
Did you have a pot of coffee? Because we're going to be here till 2
Is that
a.m.
what you told me? Mail order rights.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, I've got to tell the real story about how Recycle really got its name. I've been corrected. This is what you guys that know me have got to do. For the next thing, you've got to tell me when to stop. I told you that to start with. Recycle really. This is a sad story. There was a woman who was being taken to the insane asylum. Where was the insane asylum? Milledgeville. This is where everybody. If you ever go to Milledgeville, you're in trouble. There was a woman that was on a bus being taken down to Roosevelt on Milledgeville on her bus, and the bus stopped at Recycle, and she got out of the sack, and they said, "Recycle, recycle, recycle." So you've heard those stories. I got corrected on this because I thought Vicki had told me. She said, that's not the real story. I thought, did I tell you something wrong after all? That was the other story. They've had that mail story bride or the recycler. Or someone else said there was a ugly woman get it. That's who it was, selling mail order bride, and she was so ugly. They said, "Recycle, recycle." These things that you've gotten on my list are all on my list. But let me read the list to you, just so you know. Somebody wanted me to talk about Oakley. Somebody wanted to talk about Roland Hayes. I got to hear Roland Hayes 3 times, and I may be the only person in Calhoun that got to hear Roland Hayes. He's our most famous musician and most famous black person, and really one of our most famous, the only really famous person nationwide besides Burt Lance, and that's one of the things somebody wanted to talk about the Burt Lance story, because Burt has done so much for Calhoun. The other thing is, what about the ladies' park and the gentlemen's park, these were the parks on the other side. And about how important the railroad was to Gordon County, because my great grandmother rode the first train from Calhoun to Chattanooga when the train was opened up. Because it's strange to think for us with our modern conveniences how important the railroad was to the history of the world, for that matter. Because it's just, did anybody else get to ride the train to Atlanta? Because it was wonderful. You get on the train, 2 beautiful stations down in Atlanta, handsome buildings that were just beautiful buildings, and the same thing with the bus. You could ride the bus to Atlanta, or you could sleep on the train when you took a long trip. Some of you might have gotten to go on the senior trip to Atlanta. I mean, to Washington, D.C., that was always a trip. But one of the things that, let me go on with and the other thing, talk about the Chota Cotton Mill, which was so important to the history of Calhoun, because in 1900, just a little bit after that, when they opened up the cotton mill, it was really a separate town almost, because it had a school, it had a store, and they had a ball game and all this. It was really important to the whole area, and the folks that lived in the buildings, they would have contests between the different mill village cities, in competition with baseball usually. They always had a good thing. And all right. Anyway, one of the things after the Civil War, the next thing that happened, well, of course, when the Yankees came through Calhoun, they didn't burn the courthouse. But we lost all the records, so we don't have any records in the courthouse until 1864, because they burned the minutes before that, the messages of the rules before then. But anyway, after the war, the next thing was Calhoun was devastated. The United States government brought us food. In 1950, a family up in Ohio sent the Calhoun Women's Club a little book. And in the front of the book, it says, this is a list of the destitute people in Gordon County who in July of 1864 got food. 1865. So in other words, the United States government brought us food twice in 1865. And don't you wonder 2 things. What did First of all, how did they find out about the food? How was the communication exchanged? And other words, what did they bring us? Did they bring rice? Did they bring sugar? Did they bring coffee? Did they bring what did they? And I know Calhoun is not the only place that they brought food, but in the book that was sent to Calhoun in 1950 was given to the Calhoun Women's Club, as I said, and they gave it to Aunt Bay Hall, my Aunt Bay Hall, who was one of the presidents of the Calhoun Women's Club. And it lists all the people, and it's interesting, it's in alphabetical order, and it lists most of the women. So anybody who might have had your relatives here in 1865 would be interesting to see if that person got her name in. Most of them women. There's a few men, but in alphabetical order. A man named Albert Snow was the federal soldier that brought the food. And don't you wonder if any of the other communities saved a book like that? So that we have two things in the Gordon County History book, in Gordon County Historical Society, the Oakley. And that's one of the things we have this book, and it lists all those names. The other thing we have is a Carnegie Medal. In 1912, a man was at a well that he dropped dynamite in to deepen the well. And a month or two later, he went down in the well to clean it out so the water would be better, and he passed out. And so the neighbors ran to a man named William Hall. And he got Preacher Hall to go down in the well. He tied a rope around and brought him up. They brought the farmer up. Then they dropped the rope back down. And he tied it around himself, and then he got knocked in the head. And nobody would go get him. Came back to Calhoun. They got a man named Loomis Little, who was a black man, and Loomis Little went down the well, tied a rope around him, pulled up. This was Uncle Will Hall. Pulled him up, and then they dropped the rope back down and pulled up. Well, they gave the family, the Hall family, which was my grandmother's family, the husband, the wife, Uncle Rebecca Hall, a Carnegie Medal. So we have the Carnegie Medal. For the rest of her life, she got a stipend and they also gave the daughter, who was named Timothy, money until she was 18. And we have the Carnegie Medal in the Gordon County Historical Society. Because that's what we founded as a result of the bicentennial. We decided to have first of all, we were going to rewrite the book, the history of Gordon County, which had been written in 1934. So that was the reason the group met. Then as a result of the meeting, we said we need not only to do a history update from 1934 to 1975, we need to update the history, but we need to have a historical society. So as a result of that, we have a historical society. And so that is, we bought the house that is really, they're not but two houses that I know of in Calhoun that were here when the Yankees came through. The Oakley is next door to the fire station. It was originally a 4-room house. There were 2 rooms up and 2 rooms back. And so the Brown family added the rooms in the back and something else. All right. Oh, World War II, yeah, we had to talk about World War II. You know we don't have time to do all this. Now, aren't y'all lucky? I ain't going to. It's so much fun. I'm sorry. Are you going to pay me what I'm worth or what I think I'm worth? I ain't worth nothing, folks, I'll tell you. It's such a pleasure. See, you can tell I didn't teach you kids, but I will have the honor of saying I have a student, just one student here. Can you imagine what it's like to be in my classroom? I don't know what it was, but I'll tell you what, folks, for those of you that are other teachers, those of the retired teachers look back to how easy it was to be in those days. I miss Teresa because I went to the Peace Corps, and which is another talk about that, because you just won't believe what it was like to be in Turkey and when I was there those 2 years. Because I will tell you, if you ever talk to a student in Turkey, he would say, Mr. Lay talked about a place across the United States called United States. There's also a place called Calhoun. I talked about Calhoun just as bad. I would teach the Calhoun Times. Dr. Billy's daughter got married, and I taught her wedding invitation to those students. And the other thing, they all had bad breath because they ate a lot of garlic, and so they would all come in just like a cloud. So the longer I taught, I would watch the clock, and I would see, I'd get closer to the door, and I would run down the hall. My students would all chase me and say, "Ho John." That means my teacher. I think it meant that. I smiled for 2 years in Peace Corps, folks. I didn't know what those people said. I can't understand English, much less Turkish. But you can. There's one thing I learned is you can well imagine how hard it is to know English, because you think all the idioms and all the things we have. But anyway, the other question was what was World War II like? But we'll just have to have that another time. We'll say that. Because now, who's going to call the time on me? How much more time do I have?
Good.
5 minutes. 5 minutes. I'd rather leave you and say, come back and say, the empty law. See, at least in the class, they couldn't get out. Y'all can't get out either. Well, you can get out if you want to. But the other thing that we talk about in relation to the three things that I talked about: the English, the Indian story, the war story, and the bedspread industry. As you know, did anybody's folks here have their kinfolks that works at the cotton mill or any of the Chanel bedspreads? Okay, good. I'd love to have participation there. As you know from the history that you've been told about, at one time the bedspread industry was a cottage industry, and the people would take pieces of cloth the size of a bed, and the farmers' wives would turf them. They called them tuft them. We call it turf. They were tough, but they called them turfers. And the people would get something like 35 cents or a nickel or some small amount of money for each one that they would put the threads into, and then they would take them to the factories, and they would wash them, and the little piece of cotton would puff up and make the bedspread. But anyway, you start off being a small time thing. Then as the years went along, the people realized they could open up a factory, and they could have sewing machines, and of course it led to the carpet industry that we have today in Calhoun. So it was a big deal. The cotton mill was a big deal. The children cotton mills, they made sheeting. They made sheeting here in Calhoun. And there's one thing left to the cotton mill. What is it? The smokestack is all that's left. And the houses there were the people were talking about the interesting things in Calhoun that came in. They said that neighborhood is really one of the most interesting architecturally speaking there. Well, of the time until it disappeared. And of course, a lot of people heard the whistles go off at 2 o'clock when they changed things. But so that was the other thing. And of course, the other thing that's been important to Calhoun has been I have a list of things that are interesting for people to talk about. One of the railroads, which we just talked about, the churches of Calhoun, the schools of Calhoun in Gordon County, the cotton mill, the Dixie Highway. Big deal when they opened up the Dixie Highways in Calhoun. We have pictures of these things. The President Carter's visit. Big deal. Oakley, the Carnegie Mill I mentioned before, the Barnsley Garden story. We have a connection with the Barnsley Garden story. And the first women to vote, how important. There were 9 women in 1920 that voted in the first election that the women were voted for. Isn't it hard, folks, to imagine for all of us, men and women, how hard it was for the women to get to vote? because you women were not supposed to vote. You were supposed to have our children. That's all you were. And to wait on us. We wanted you to wait on us after you've had your baby. There's a man down in Bartow County that his wife had a baby, and this is Robin and Ted Collins' daddy's story. The woman had the baby, and so the doctor had been there all night with the baby. They were so happy after they was well, and so he walked into the daddy walked into the doctor's room as he was getting ready. He says, "Doctor, would you like to have breakfast before you leave?" And the doctor said, "Well, yeah, I believe I would." He went into the bedroom and says, "Honey, you're going to have to get up. The doctor wants breakfast." After all, you had my baby. Why not have my breakfast? I just love stories like that. And then someday I can tell you the silly things about that happened what happened to my family when the Yankees came through. Because my grandmother watched the Yankees. Her father-in-law was too old to go, but her husband was in the war, and they watched empty the house. They took everything out of the house, just like you see, just like in Gone with the Wind. It's really complicated war because and of course I will have to tell y'all folks, nobody talks about things like this that I know of except me, because people have more important things to talk about today. It's just really interesting. But anyway. Most of all, I remember Calhoun, because you have to know one thing that you might hear if you come to my funeral, which is not going to be like this is all I mentioned. You might hear, nestling among mountains, sparkling with fountains, beautiful, witty, beautiful city, Calhoun. My heart ever beats for thy pleasing retreats, where the sunlight is gentle at noon. For trees never made a lovelier shade than falls of thy bosom in June. The beautiful river flows onward forever. His rhythms flow on to the sea. But the farther he flows, the sadder he grows, for he passes no city like thee. And he mingles his moans with the ocean's wild groans, while his spirit flows backward with me. My heart, like that river, time cannot dissever, though the trend of my life treads away. It touches thee still, thy shock and thy thrill, with me forever and aye. Recollections are flowers in memory's bowers, and they bloom in December and May. Mr. Ernest Neal, very folksy kind of thing, but he talked about beautiful city Calhoun. And I remember. And if I talk to you again sometime, I'm going to tell you what, I'm going to start at my house and I'm going to walk down to Calhoun, downtown, and tell you what it all looked like when I was a boy. Yeah, I remember.
We'll be there.
Goodbye.
Let's give Jim another big round of applause. We really appreciate him coming out and doing this for us tonight.
You know you have a standing ovation. You got to talk for 30 more minutes.
Oh, no.
Yeah, again, like